On a cold December day, in the Archbishop's palace of the city of Alcalá de Henares, a girl was born. She arrived quietly into the world, but her arrival would echo through centuries. History announced the birth of an infanta of Castile and Aragon, daughter of the two most powerful rulers of the Iberian Peninsula, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. The infant was named Catalina, but the world would come to know her by another name, Catherine of Aragon, a name that would forever alter the fate of England and of an entire civilization. Her parents were in the midst of completing something extraordinary, the unification of Spain. Their marriage in 1469 had joined the two greatest Christian kingdoms of the peninsula, laying the foundation for what would become the most powerful empire on earth. As the infant Catalina took her first steps across the marble floors of the palace, her mother Isabella had already made history as the queen who financed Christopher Columbus, who had sailed west into the unknown and returned with a new world. Her father Ferdinand was celebrated as a master diplomat and military commander, the man who had completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish rule. In the very year of Catalina's birth, his armies were preparing the final assault on Granada, the last Moorish kingdom on Spanish soil. The little infanta grew up in an atmosphere of triumph and majesty. Her childhood unfolded among gilded palaces, where the Latin of learned monks blended with the Sicilian speech of court ladies. Isabella, herself a woman of exceptional education, insisted that all her daughters be schooled to the highest standards of the age. Catalina studied Latin, French, theology, canon law, heraldry and genealogy. She was taught to embroider, to dance, to play musical instruments, and above all, to carry herself with royal dignity. She grew into a devout Catholic, absorbing her mother's religious fire, a faith that was not merely spiritual comfort, but the very foundation of royal power. But behind the splendor of her upbringing lay a single, defining purpose. She was being prepared for a dynastic marriage. In those days, princesses were instruments of diplomacy, living seals on political alliances between kingdoms. Catalina understood this from an early age. She watched her older sisters leave home one by one, sent to foreign courts in service of the crown. Isabella married the King of Portugal. Juana was betrothed to Philip of Habsburg. Maria, too, was born for a Portuguese marriage. Catalina would follow the same path, but her fate was tied to a distant, fog-covered island in the north of Europe. England, at the close of the 15th century, was only beginning to heal from the wounds of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York that had bled the kingdom for more than 30 years. A new king had risen from the wreckage, Henry VIII of the House of Tudor, who had united the warring factions by Mary Elizabeth of York. Henry understood that his dynasty was young, his grip on power fragile. He needed something England had rarely possessed, legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. A Spanish alliance could give him that. And Ferdinand and Isabella, for their part, needed allies against France, their most dangerous rival. The interests of two great dynasties aligned across a sea. In 1488, when Catalina was barely 3 years old, negotiations began between the Spanish and English courts for her future marriage to Prince Arthur Tudor, heir to the English throne. Arthur was nearly a year younger than the Spanish infanta. The formal betrothal agreement was signed in 1497, when the girl had just turned 12. Under the terms of the treaty, Catalina would bring a dowry of 200,000 gold écus, an enormous sum that announced both the wealth of Spain and the gravity of this union. The following years passed in preparation. Catalina polished her French, the common tongue of European courts, and began learning English, though the English nobility of that era still preferred French for formal affairs. She was taught English customs and etiquette. She was told stories of the Island Kingdom, its saints, its kings, its grey skies and restless seas. She understood, with a clarity that must have cost her something, that she was leaving the sun of Spain forever. That she would never again see the orange groves of Andalusia. Never again hear Castilian spoken in her parents' palaces. Ahead lay an unknown world, a cold country, rain and winds from the northern sea. On the 20th of September 1501, 16-year-old Catalina boarded a ship at the Spanish port of La Coroa. She was accompanied by an impressive retinue, court ladies, priests, servants, soldiers. Several ships carried her dowry, chests of gold coin, precious fabrics, sacred vessels, books. On the 2nd of October, the fleet reached the English shore at Plymouth. Catalina stepped onto the soil of the country that would become her home and her battlefield. She was welcomed with honors befitting a future queen. The local people gathered to see the Spanish princess, and many were struck by her appearance. She was compact and fair, a girl with the distinctive features of the Trastamara dynasty, a straight nose, a rounded face, a defined chin, light auburn hair, blue eyes, very pale skin. Contemporaries noted her regal bearing and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. The journey from Plymouth to London took several weeks. The procession moved slowly along English roads, pausing at the castles and estates of great lords. In every town and village, people came out to see the foreign bride, some threw flowers, others simply standing in silence beside the road, watching the stranger who was destined to become their queen. On the 14th of November 1501, the wedding of Catalina and Arthur Tudor took place at the cathedral in London. The ceremony was grand. The bride wore white, with a long train and a crown upon her head. Arthur, 15 years old, pale and slight beside his more robustly built bride, had always been a child of fragile health. But no one could have known how short their marriage would be. After the wedding celebrations, the young couple was sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where the Prince of Wales was traditionally expected to govern the borderlands, learning the craft of kingship. The castle rose on a hill above the River Teme, surrounded by thick walls and towers. The winter of 1501 to 1502 was particularly brutal. Cold winds howled down from the Welsh mountains, piercing even the thick stone walls. 6 months into their marriage, an epidemic swept through the castle. The chroniclers called it the sweating sickness, a mysterious illness that stalked England repeatedly through the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Its victims were seized suddenly with fever and weakness, their bodies convulsing with chills, then drenched in sweat. Many were dead within hours. Arthur fell ill in early April. Physicians tried everything they knew: bloodletting, herbal decoctions, prayer. Nothing helped. On the 2nd of April 1502, Prince Arthur Tudor died, just short of his 16th birthday. Catalina also fell ill, but she survived. When the worst had passed and she could rise from her bed, the 16-year-old girl found herself a widow in a foreign country, with no clear idea of what would come next. By the laws of that time, the widow of a deceased husband was expected to return to her family, along with the unpaid portion of their dowry. But Henry VIII had no desire to part with either the Spanish gold or the Spanish alliance. And Ferdinand of Aragon had no wish to return the money already paid or to lose his English foothold. Two kings began searching for a way to preserve the dynasty's union. The solution presented itself quickly enough. Henry VII had a second son, Henry, Duke of York. After Arthur's death, this boy became heir to the throne. In 1502 he was 11 years old, too young for marriage but old enough for a formal betrothal. It was decided that Catalina would remain in England and wait until the young prince reached a suitable age. But there was a serious canonical obstacle. Church law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. Such a union was considered incestuous, forbidden by biblical texts, specifically by the Book of Leviticus. However, the Church allowed for exceptions. The Pope could issue a papal dispensation, a special document that suspended the canonical prohibition in particular circumstances. The English and Spanish courts appealed to Pope Julius II for precisely such a dispensation. In their petition, they cited another biblical law, the levirate, an ancient Hebrew custom by which a younger brother was obligated to marry his dead brother's childless widow to carry on his lineage. But there was another question, one that would reverberate through history for decades. Had the marriage between Catalina and Arthur ever been physically consummated? If it had not, no canonical obstacle existed at all. Catalina swore on the road that her marriage to Arthur had never been physically completed, that she had remained a virgin after her first husband's death. This declaration would become one of the most debated statements in English history. In June 1503, Pope Julius II issued a bull permitting the marriage between Henry and Catalina. The verdict was carefully crafted to cover both scenarios. Whether or not the first marriage had been consummated, the Pope removed the obstacle. On the 25th of June, 1503, 11-year-old Prince Henry and 17-year-old Catalina were formally betrothed. And then, the waiting began. Catalina found herself in a strange limbo, not a wife, but not free. Bound by a promise to a boy 6 years her junior, who was still a child. Henry VIII used the betrothal as a diplomatic tool, periodically hinting he might dissolve it should Ferdinand fail to be sufficiently cooperative in political matters. She had become a hostage in the games of kings. Her financial situation deteriorated steadily. Henry VII granted her only a meager allowance, barely enough to maintain a dignified appearance. Her Spanish retinue dwindled. Some members returned home, unable to bear the hardships of life at an English court ruled by a misere. Catalina drifted from royal castle to royal castle, with no permanent home of her own. She wrote desperate letters to her father, complaining of poverty and uncertainty, begging him to intervene. Ferdinand was busy with his political projects in Italy and did not rush to his daughter as yet. Then, in 1560, came a blow that changed everything. Catalina's mother died. Queen Isabella of Castile was gone. It was not only a personal tragedy for a princess who had lost the person closest to her heart. It was a political catastrophe. Isabella had always been the driving force behind Spanish diplomacy. She had personally championed the English match and monitored its terms. With her death, Castile and Aragon effectively separated. Ferdinand, fighting to retain control over both kingdoms, had increasingly little attention to spare for his youngest daughter stranded in a foreign land. Catalina was 20 years old and utterly alone. In 1506, Henry VII went so far as to compel his 14-year-old son to publicly declare that he did not consider himself bound by the betrothal to Catalina, since it had been contracted when he was still a minor. It was a humiliating blow. Catalina understood that she might be cast out of England without her dowry, without means, disgraced in the eyes of all Europe. But she did not break. She refused to leave. She insisted on the terms of the marriage agreement. She wrote to the Pope and to European monarchs, demanding support. And in 1507, Ferdinand of Aragon, perhaps finally recognizing her value, appointed his daughter as Spain's ambassador to the English court. An unprecedented act. Catalina became the first female ambassador in European history. The appointment was largely symbolic, but it gave her official standing, a recognized role, a platform. She was no longer merely a Vedic woman. She was a diplomat. While Catalina endured her long purgatory, the young prince who would one day marry her was growing into something remarkable. When Duke of York, now Prince of Wales, was tall, athletic, charismatic. He was the absolute opposite of his frail older brother, built for tournaments and hunting, passionate about music and dance, fluent in theology, history, Latin, French, and Spanish. He played the lute, composed songs, possessed a fine singing voice. He was fascinated by the new humanist ideas flowing from Italy, and corresponded with some of the greatest scholars of his age, among them the legendary Erasmus of Rotterdam. Henry was, in the language of his time, a Renaissance prince, the embodiment of an era. On the 21st of April, 1509, King Henry VII died at the Richmond Palace. He was 52 years old and had ruled England for 24 years, long enough to plant the Tudor dynasty firmly on the throne and to leave his heirs a full treasury. His death was the turning point Catalina had been waiting 7 years for. The 17-year-old prince became King Henry VIII, and one of the first acts of the new reign was to fulfill the promise to the Spanish crown. He would marry Catherine of Aragon. On the 11th of June, 1509, in a quiet ceremony at the chapel of Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were married. There were no grand festivities, not like the spectacle that had surrounded her first wedding to Arthur. Henry wanted to draw as little attention as possible to the circumstances. After all, he was marrying his brother's widow, even if with papal dispensation. Catherine was 23, Henry 17. The age gap was unusual for an era when husbands were almost always older than their wives. But the young king paid it no mind. By the accounts of those who knew them in these early years, Henry was genuinely attached to his wife. On the 24th of June, 1509, a magnificent coronation ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey. Henry and Catherine were crowned together, a statement of their equal status as a ruling pair. Catherine walked the length of the nave in a golden crown and a mantle blazing with jewels. The Archbishop of Canterbury anointed her with sacred oil and placed upon her head the crown of the Queens of England. After 8 years of humiliating uncertainty, the Spanish princess had finally become what she had been born to be. A queen. London celebrated 4 days. Tournaments, feasts, theatrical performances. The people cheered their young monarchs and dared to hope that a new golden age had begun. The early years of Henry's reign were, by all accounts, a time of genuine joy. The young king burned with energy, with ambition, with a hunger for glory. He wanted to be remembered like the heroes of antiquity he had studied in Latin chronicles. Catherine supported him in all his endeavors. She was an educated woman, shaped by the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, steeped in politics, strategy, diplomacy. The royal couple spent their days hunting, jousting, making music. Henry wrote songs and dedicated them to his wife. At the tournaments, she rode into the lists bearing her initials and her colors, with a motto praising her beauty and virtue. But behind all this visible happiness lay a single, relentless obligation. The queen must produce an heir. The Tudor dynasty was still young. The memory of civil war had not faded. Everyone understood what was at stake, a male heir who would secure the succession and prevent the kingdom from plunging back into chaos. Catherine became pregnant shortly after the wedding. In January 1510, she delivered a stillborn daughter. It was a heavy blow, but the queen bore it with courage. Months later, she was pregnant again. On the 1st of January 1511, New Year's Day, Catherine gave birth to a boy. The court erupted in joy. The child was named Henry, Duke of Cornwall. The king organized grand celebrations. A Thanksgiving service was held at Westminster Abbey. Bonfires blazed on the streets of London. Wine and food were distributed to the poor. Special coins were struck in honor of the prince's birth. Henry VIII was at the pinnacle of happiness. He had a wife he loved and a son who would carry his dynasty forward. Catherine, too, was happy. She had fulfilled her primary duty to her husband and her kingdom. The happiness lasted 52 days. The infant prince died. The cause was never established. Infant mortality in that era was appallingly high, even in royal families. The grief of both king and queen was profound. Catherine withdrew into her chambers and spent her days in prayer. Henry tried to console her, but was devastated himself. Catherine tried again, and again. The next pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Then another. Court physicians shook their heads, baffled by the pattern of repeated failure. In the early 16th century, medicine had no concept of RH incompatibility, of genetic factors affecting the viability of a pregnancy. Catherine prayed relentlessly. She attended mass after mass. She gave alms, made pilgrimages, pressed her lips to the relics of saints. The pregnancies continued to fail. The year 1513 brought an unexpected interruption to this private anguish. The international situation demanded the king's attention. Henry VIII had joined the League of Cambrai, a military alliance against France, alongside Spain, the Popes, and the Holy Roman Emperor. The young king dreamed of military glory, of reclaiming French territories that the English crown had coveted since the Hundred Years' War. In the summer of 1513, Henry resolved to lead the expulsion personally. He would cross the Channel and take the field himself. This meant leaving England without a king. And so Henry made a decision that reveals, more than almost anything else, how deeply he trusted his wife. He appointed Catherine of Araga regent of England. It was an act of enormous confidence. Henry knew that his wife possessed something rare, the intelligence of a scholar, the training of a diplomat, and the iron nerve of a woman who had survived years of humiliation without flinching. Catherine accepted the responsibility with the gravity she had absorbed in childhood at the court of her parents. While Henry campaigned in France, she presided over the royal council, received ambassadors, granted audiences, signed state documents. But the most important test of her regency came not from France, it came from the north. King James IV of Scotland, bound to France by treaty, saw his opportunity. With the English king across the Channel, he gathered his army and crossed the border, ravaging the northern English counties. It was a serious threat. A lesser regent might have panicked. Catherine did not. She issued mobilization orders to the northern counties, appointed commanders, organized supply lines, and prepared the kingdom for war, all while reportedly being in the early stages of another pregnancy. On the 9th of September 1513, the Battle of Flodden Field was fought, one of the most decisive events in the history of Anglo-Scottish conflict. The English army, commanded by the Earl of Surrey, crushed the Scottish forces. King James IV was killed on the field, along with a devastated portion of Scotland's nobility. It was a brilliant victory, and Catherine had every right to be proud of her role in it. According to some sources, she addressed the troops before the battle, reviewed them with a queen's words. She certainly wrote to Henry in France with the news of the victory, and, in a gesture as powerful as it was striking, enclosed a piece of the slain Scottish Duke's blood-stained coat. After the triumph at Flodden, Catherine's authority at court and in the country grew considerably. She had proven that she could govern a kingdom as well as any man. that in her veins ran the blood of the great Spanish monarchs who had forged a nation. Henry returned from France in late 1513. His own military campaign had been less impressive than his wife's victory over the Scots, which must, one suspects, have quietly stuck his pride, though he gave no sign of it. Court life resumed its familiar rhythms: hunting, tournaments, music, feasting. The royal couple went on as before, to all outward appearances content. But underneath, something had begun to shift. Catherine became pregnant again in 1513. The child was born dead. It was the fourth or fifth failure. And at the court, whispers had begun to circulate. Was this marriage cursed? Had it been a mistake to allow a king to marry his brother's widow? Catherine heard the whispers. She endured them and kept praying. In 1516, after another difficult pregnancy, she finally carried a child to term. On the 18th of February, at the Greenwich Palace, a girl was born. She was healthy, strong, crying loudly. Catherine wept with relief. The girl was named Mary, after the Virgin and after Henry's younger sister, the French Queen. Henry was disappointed that the child was not a boy, but had tried not to show it. He loved his small daughter, played with her, monitored her upbringing with care. Princess Mary was given the finest nurses and tutors. She grew into a serious, devout child, unmistakably her mother's daughter in character. But Catherine did not stop trying. After Mary's birth, there were more pregnancies. All ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Bedemit na 5-2, it had become clear that Catherine was unlikely to conceive again. She was past 40, old, by the standards of the 16th century. Her body had been worn down by repeated pregnancies and losses. She had grown heavier, her face had become puffy, her health had deteriorated. And Henry VIII had begun to look at his wife with different eyes. He was still in his prime, vigorous, imposing, surrounded by beautiful court ladies. A man who had once been Europe's golden prince. He had grown restless. He took a mistress, Elizabeth Blount, who gave him an illegitimate son, Henry VIII, in 1519. Then other women followed. Catherine knew of the affairs. She said nothing. Royal mistresses were an accepted feature of court life. A queen was not expected to object as long as appearances were maintained. But the birth of Viceroy had proved one critical thing. The king was capable of fathering sons. Used not with Catherine. This realization locked itself in Henry's mind like a splinter. He began returning to a text from Leviticus, the very warning that had been discussed when his father had arranged a papal dispensation all those years ago. The verse that read, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity, they shall be childless." Were they not, in truth, childless? One surviving daughter, was that not as good as not? Around 1525, a young woman arrived at a court who would change the course of history. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, an experienced diplomat and courtier, and had spent several years at the French court, the most sophisticated in Europe, and had returned to England as a woman of extraordinary polish, educated, witty, possessed of a magnetic quality that drew men's eyes. She was not classically beautiful, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, with a sharp chin. But there was something about her that was electric. Henry VIII fell for Anne Boleyn with a passion that went far beyond any of his previous infatuations. He wrote her love letters. He showered her with gifts. He spent every hour he could in her company. This was not an affair. It was an obsession. But Anne, unlike her predecessors, refused to become his mistress. She made her position clear. She would share his bed when, and only when, they made her his queen. It was a breathtaking gamble. But it worked. By 1527, Henry had made up his mind. He would end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He would marry in Boleyn. In 1527, Henry announced his intention to have his marriage to Catherine annulled. He argued that the marriage had been unlawful from the beginning, that the papal dispensation permitting him to marry his brother's widow had been improperly granted. He invoked the biblical prohibition and claimed that God had punished him for his sin by denying him a male heir. He demanded that Pope Clement VII declare the marriage invalid and permit him to remarry. This demand placed the Pope in an impossible position. On one hand, the Duke of England was an important ally of the Church. On the other, annulling a royal marriage after so many years would set a dangerous precedent. And there was a more immediate problem. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful monarch in Europe, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. Charles had already made clear that he would protect his aunt's honor and would not permit a humiliating divorce to proceed. In 1527, the emperor's troops sacked Rome, effectively holding the Pope captive. Under these conditions, Clement VII could not possibly grant Henry what he wanted. What followed was a legal battle of extraordinary complexity. Historians call it the King's Great Matter. Henry assembled the finest theologians and jurists in Europe to build his case. Catherine assembled her own defenders. The arguments, counter-arguments, precedents, and dispensations piled up over years. In 1529, a special ecclesiastical court was convened in London, presided over by two cardinals, Thomas Wolsey, Henry's Lord Chancellor, and Lorenzo Campiglio, the papal legate. This court was to decide the fate of the Queen. On the 21st of June, 1529, Catherine of Aragon appeared at a tribunal in the Hall of Blackfriars. The room was packed with sorters, clergy, and lawyers. The king and queen sat side by side, with the cardinals on the bench. The tension was palpable. Everyone present understood what was at stake. When the case was called, something happened that no one expected. Catherine rose from her seat. She walked across the room, not toward the judges, but toward the king. She knelt before her husband and spoke. She spoke in English, her Spanish accent still audible after nearly 30 years in England. She addressed Henry as her husband and her lord. She reminded him of 20 years of marriage. She reminded him of the daughter they had raised together. She swore under oath, solemnly, before God, that she had come to him a virgin, that her marriage to Arthur had never been physically consummated, and that therefore no canonical obstacle had ever existed. She spoke of her obedience, her faithfulness, her suffering. She described how she had borne and lost child after child in service of his dynasty. She begged him to remember mercy, justice, the fear of God's comment. And then she declared that she did not recognize the jurisdiction of this court, that its judges were not impartial, that Wolsey served the English king and Campiglio was bound by Roman instructions. She demanded that the case be referred to the Pope himself, the only authority with the right to decide such matters. Then she stood, bowed to the king, and walked out. She was called back. She did not turn around. She was called again. She kept walking. She left the hall and never appeared before the court again. It was an act of breathtaking courage. Henry was furious and could not help but admire her. The trial continued without her. Witnesses gave testimony about what had happened on the night after her wedding to Arthur, nearly 30 years ago. Old sortiers were asked to dredge up memories. Had Arthur consummated the marriage? Some claimed the prince had boasted of it the next morning. Others said he had been too ill and frail. The whole exercise was degrading. The most intimate details of Catherine's first marriage were discussed publicly, scrutinized by strangers, weighed by lawyers. She bore it with unbroken dignity. Her legal position was, in fact, strong. The papal bull of Julius II had explicitly covered God's sinner's use, whether or not the first marriage had been consummated. She had been a lawful wife to Henry for 20 years. He had lived with her as his queen, fathered a child with her, acknowledged the marriage as valid. To suddenly declare it null and void required an extraordinary act of judicial contortion. Cardinal Campeggio understood this, and did what experienced diplomats do in impossible situations. He styled. In July 1529, he announced an adjournment, cited the Roman court's summer recess. Henry realized no decision was coming. He was enraged. He stripped Wolsey of the chancellorship and confiscated his property. The great cardinal, who had effectively governed England for 15 years, died on the road to prison in 1550. Into the vacuum stepped a man of a very different kind, Thomas Cromwell, former secretary to Wolsey, a cold, brilliant, utterly pragmatic lawyer. Cromwell offered Henry a solution that no one else had dared propose. If the Pope would not grant a divorce, England would simply leave the Pope behind. The logic was straightforward and devastating. The King of England would declare himself supreme head of the Church in England. English ecclesiastical courts would have final authority over all religious matters, including marriage. No appeals to Rome. No papal interference. A church that answered to the crown. Henry, who had spent his youth writing theological tracts defending papal authority, who had been granted the title Defender of the Faith by a previous pope, now began to find this idea increasingly attractive. The ground had been prepared by history. In Germany, Martin Luther had already broken with Rome. His ideas were spreading across Europe, finding fertile soil in kingdoms where people had long fought against the wealth and corruption of the Church. The Reformation was not simply a theological dispute, it was a political earthquake. In the years 1530 to 1533, Henry moved with systematic deliberation. Parliament passed laws limiting clerical privileges and asserting royal supremacy over spiritual matters. The English clergy, under intense pressure, acknowledged Henry as supreme head of the Church in England. Thomas Cromwell gathered evidence against the monasteries, preparing for their dissolution and the seizure of their vast assets. The break with Rome was happening piece by piece, law by law. Catherine watched these developments with horror. She understood, with perfect clarity, that what was being decided was not merely her personal fate, but the religious destiny of a nation. The shattering of Christian unity in Europe. She wrote desperate letters to the Pope, to the Emperor, to the Spanish court, begging for help and protection. The answers were sympathetic and useless. Emperor Charles was fighting the Turks in the east and France in the west. He had no capacity for military intervention in England. Catherine was alone, facing a king who had decided to move the earth to get what he wanted, and who was moving it. Her position at the court deteriorated rapidly. Henry openly kept company with Anne Boleyn, who conducted herself as though she were already queen. Catherine was excluded from official ceremonies. The king avoided direct contact, communicating through intermediaries. Anne Boleyn wore Catherine's jewels, mocked the aging queen, reveled in her power over the king. Sorters, reading the winds, shifted their allegiances. Only a few loyal friends remained. Catherine held firm. She continued to conduct herself as queen, observing all the ceremonies that pertained to her rank, wearing royal dress, requiring that she be addressed as Her Majesty. In her eyes, she was and would always be the lawful wife of Henry VIII, crowned and anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. No court ruling, no royal decree could erase that. God had joined them in marriage. Only that could separate them. In early 1553, Anne Boleyn became pregnant. This changed everything. Henry was convinced and was carrying his son, the heir he had spent 20 years waiting for. He could not allow the child to be born illegitimate. He needed to be married to and before the birth. Since the Pope continued to refuse the annulment, Henry resolved to act without papal authority. On the 25th of June, 1530, Henry VIII secretly married in Boleyn in a private chapel. Only a handful of trusted witnesses were present. Formally, Henry was still married to Catherine. The ceremony was kept secret, but rumors spread through London within days. In February 1533, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, forbidding appeals to Rome on an illegal matter touching England. This law effectively declared England independent of papal jurisdiction. All ecclesiastical cases would henceforth be decided within the kingdom without reference to Rome. It was a revolutionary rupture. 1,000 years of England's connection to the Roman Church severed by a single act of Parliament. For Catherine, it meant one thing above all others: there was no longer any path to a fair hearing before the Pope. In March 1530, Cromwell Aragon appointed Thomas Cranmer as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was a committed reformer and a firm supporter of the king's desire for an annulment. In April, Cranmer convened an ecclesiastical court at Unstable, a small town not far from London. Catherine was summoned. She refused to appear, denied the jurisdiction of an English archbishop over a matter that rightfully belonged to the Pope. The court proceeded without her. On the 23rd of May, 1530, Thomas Cranmer declared the marriage between Henry and phenomenal and void from its very beginning. The reasoning was surgical in its brutality. Catherine had been the widow of Henry's brother, so a marriage was prohibited by canon law. The papal dispensation, Cranmer ruled, had been granted on false grounds, on the assertion that the first marriage had not been consummated, when in fact the court declared it had. Therefore, the dispensation was invalid. The marriage with Henry had never existed in the eyes of the Church. With a stroke of the pen, 24 years of marriage were declared a legal fiction. Catherine automatically lost the title of Queen of England. She was to be known henceforth as the Dowager Princess of Wales, the title she had held after Arthur's death, a title she had always refused to accept. Her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate, stripped of the title of princess, expelled from the line of succession. On the 1st of June, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. The coronation procession passed through the streets of London from the Tower to the Abbey, and was dressed in purple, a crown blazing on her head, her pregnant belly visible beneath her robes. But the streets of London were quiet. The crowd did not cheer. Some turned away. Many stood in silence. The people of England remembered Catherine. They had seen her lead the country through war. They had seen her in the churches, praying with the poor. They had watched her endure humiliation after humiliation with quiet dignity. They saw in Anne Boleyn not a queen, but a usurper, a woman who had taken another woman's place. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth. It was a girl. Henry's disappointment was enormous. After everything, the divorce, the break with Rome, the destruction of his first marriage, they had another daughter. The child was named Elizabeth. Henry declared her his heir, stripping Mary of that status. The irony was not lost on those who watched. The king had abandoned Catherine because she had given him only a daughter. And now his new wife had done the same. Catherine was removed from the royal palaces, first to a castle in Hertfordshire, then to others, each more remote, each less comfortable than the last. Always farther from London, always farther from her daughter. Henry forbade mother and daughter from seeing each other. This was the cruelest punishment of all. Mary, 17 years old, the girl who had been the beloved daughter of a king and heir to his throne, suddenly found herself declared nobody. She was called illegitimate, stripped of her title as princess, forced to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth as a simple attendant. Mary refused to recognize her parents' divorce. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen. In this she was entirely her mother's daughter. Catherine wrote to Mary letters full of love and instruction. Hold firm. Do not surrender your principles. Trust in God. But do not defy your father so openly that you endanger your life. The letters were intercepted and read by the Duke, who was infuriated by what he considered conspiracy between the two women. He demanded that Catherine formally acknowledge the court's ruling, renounce the title of queen, and accept the designation of dowager princess. She refused, absolutely and without equivocation. Every letter she wrote, every document she signed, bore the same inscription. Hviezdička Catherine, Queen, Hviezdička. When retaliated with steady, grinding cruelty, he cut her allowance to a minimum. He expelled most of her Spanish attendants. He shifted her from castle to castle, never letting her settle. The conditions of some of her lodgings were wretched, damp, cold, poorly heated. In 1534, Parliament passed of supremacy, formally declaring the supreme head of the Church of England. All subjects were required to take an oath acknowledging Henry's ecclesiastical supremacy and the validity of his marriage to Anne. To refuse was treason. Many refused. Among them were Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, Catherine's loyal friends and among the most distinguished men in England. Both were executed. Catherine mourned them. They had died, in part, for her. In 1534, Catherine was moved to Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire. It was a grim medieval fortress surrounded by marshes. Cold fogs rose from the wetlands in winter. The damp penetrated the stone walls. Wind moaned through the narrow windows. For a woman born under the burning sun of Castile, it was a particular form of torment. She suffered from rheumatism, joint pain, constant colds. The physicians had permitted her to see good little. At Kimbolton, Catherine lived in almost total isolation. She was forbidden to leave the castle grounds. Her correspondence was strictly monitored and frequently intercepted. Even confession was difficult. The king did not trust Spanish priests, fearing they might pass secret messages to the emperor. She was cut off from the world, from her daughter, from everyone she loved. The only comfort that remained was faith. The former queen spent long hours in prayer in the castle's tiny chapel. She prayed for Henry's soul. She prayed for Mary's safety. She prayed for the England that was being torn from the church she had served all her life. Despite her imprisonment, Catherine refused to stop being a queen. She insisted on all the ceremonies appropriate to her status. Her servants were required to address her as Her Majesty. Meals were conducted with royal etiquette. She wore black, the color of mourning, but always kept her jewels close, those glittering reminders of what she had been and who she remained. She embroidered vestments and altar cloths for the local church. She gave what alms she could to the poor of the surrounding villages. The local people loved her and pitied her, seeing in her a martyr, a woman who had suffered for the faith. By 1535, Catherine's health had declined sharply. She was 49 but looked far older. Her body had been worn to exhaustion by childbearing and grief. She suffered from abdominal pain, nausea, and profound weakness. Modern historians have speculated that she may have had stomach cancer or a serious cardiac condition. The medicine of her era could neither diagnose nor treat whatever was destroying her. Catherine understood that she was dying. She begged for permission to see her daughter one last time. Henry refused. They feared that a reunion between the two women would steal them both in their defiance, provide grounds for further scheming. Catherine wrote Mary her fine letters, filled with love, with counsel, with a mother's desperate tenderness. She told her daughter to remain faithful to the Catholic faith, to honor her mother's memory, but to be careful not to resist her father so openly as to put herself in mortal danger. Catherine knew that after her death, Mary would be alone, without protection, at the mercy of a father who had shown what he was capable of. On the 7th of January, 1536, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Catherine of Aragon died in her room at Kimbolton Castle. At her side were a handful of loyal servants and her confessor. She had spent the last hours of her life dictating a letter to Henry. In it, she forgave him. She said she had never stopped loving him. She asked him to be a good father to Mary. She asked him to care for his soul and to remember the certainty of God's command. She signed it, Hviezdička Catherine, Queen of England Hviezdička. Her last act was to insist on what she had always insisted on. Then she closed her eyes and died quietly. A woman who had been the daughter, the wife, and the mother of kings died effectively a prisoner, in a foreign country, far from everyone she had ever loved. When news of Catherine's death reached London, Henry VIII and Boleyn appeared at a court in bright clothing. Some accounts describe them in yellow, a color that in England might signify celebration, though in the Spanish tradition yellow carried a different meaning entirely, associated with mourning and death. The symbolism was debated then as now. Henry held a celebration, had danced with Anne, raised their daughter Elizabeth, declared that no obstacle remained to his happiness. The woman who had refused to disappear had finally gone. But many at a court and in the country received Catherine's death with deep sorrow. The common people mourned her, the devout, merciful queen who had given alms to the poor, visited hospitals, supported schools and scholars. They saw in her a martyr, a woman destroyed by a king's lust and a nation's apostasy. Requiem masses were celebrated in churches across England. Women wept. Old men shook their heads. Catherine was buried on the 29th of January, 1536, not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales, under the title she had spent the last years of her life refusing to accept. The ceremony was modest, without the royal honors due a crowned sovereign. Henry did not attend, and sent no representative. Mary was forbidden to come and say farewell to her mother. Only a small number of Catherine's loyal friends and the local people gathered at the grave. After her death, an autopsy was performed, standard practice for persons of high rank. The physicians reported that her heart was black, with a dark, unnatural growth attached to it. Her Spanish attendants immediately declared this evidence of poison, that the queen had been murdered on the orders of Anne Boleyn or her allies. The rumors spread rapidly, though no proof was ever produced. Modern historians believe that changes in Catherine's heart were almost certainly the consequence of natural disease, possibly cancer, possibly heart failure. But in a court already saturated with intrigue and distrust, the idea of poison was irresistible. The irony of what followed was almost too perfect to be coincidence. Catherine had died on the 7th of January, 1536. On the 29th of January, as her coffin was being lowered into the ground at Peterborough, Anne Boleyn miscarried a male fetus. Henry looked at the dead child and said coldly to his wife that God would not give them sons. He had already turned his eyes toward another woman, Jane Seymour, quiet and gentle, the opposite of Anne in every way. 4 months after Catherine's burial, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. But on the 19th of May, 1536, less than 5 months after Catherine's death, and Boleyn was beheaded in the courtyard of the Tower of London. The woman who had shattered Catherine's marriage had lasted precisely 17 months as queen. Many in England and across Catholic Europe saw in this the hand of Providence. Catherine had died in disgrace, but with her honor intact, her principles uncompromised, and had lived briefly in triumph and died on a scaffold, accused of crimes that would bloodstain her name forever. History had begun to render its verdict. The daughter Catherine had feared for, Mary, endured years of further suffering after her mother's death. Henry demanded that she acknowledge his supremacy over the church, the illegality of her parents' marriage, and her own illegitimacy. For months, Mary refused, her mother's iron will living on in her. Henry threatened to send her to the Tower, to try her for treason, to execute her. His advisors, Cromwell chief among them, feared that Mary's defiance would provoke a Catholic uprising. Under enormous pressure, and with her physical safety genuinely at risk, Mary finally signed a document accepting her father's demands. It was the darkest moment of her life. She felt she had betrayed her mother's memory. But she survived. Henry married 4 more times after, and Boleyn, Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, died 12 days after giving birth to his longed-for son, Prince Edward, in 1537. Henry mourned her as his only true wife, the one who had given him the heir. He was buried beside her at Windsor, as he had wished. Then came Anne of Cleves, whose marriage he was annulled within 6 months. Then Catherine Howard, young, foolish, executed for alleged adultery in 1542. Then Catherine Parr, intelligent, careful, the survivor who outlasted the king. None gave Henry more children. Henry VIII died on the 20th of January, 1547. He was 55 years old, with once magnificent body swollen and diseased almost beyond recognition. He was buried beside Jane Seymour at Windsor, as he had instructed. 9-year-old Edward VI became king, guided by Protestant regents who pushed the Reformation further than Henry had ever gone. England became increasingly Protestant, its monasteries stripped, its altars destroyed, its connection to Rome seemingly severed forever. Edward died of tuberculosis in July 1553, not yet 16. In the crisis that followed, a Protestant faction tried to bypass the line of succession by placing Lady Jane Grey, Henry VII's great-niece, on the throne. Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Her reign lasted 9 days. Mary raised her banner, and the people of England responded. Not necessarily because they loved Catholicism, many did not, but because they recognized in Mary something they valued, legitimacy. She was Henry VIII's daughter. She was Catherine of Aragon's daughter. And the memory of Catherine, her suffering, her dignity, her steadfastness, had never been forgotten. On the 19th of July, 1553, Mary rode into London as Queen of England. She was the first woman to rule England in her own name, not as regent, not as a queen consort, but as sovereign. Catherine had fought for this, had endured humiliation, exile, and imprisonment for this. And though she had not lived to see it, her struggle had not been in vain. Mary's first acts as queen included petitioning the Pope for official recognition of her parents' marriage as valid and of her own legitimacy. The recognition was granted. After 17 years, the honor Catherine had defended with her life was restored. Mary ordered masses for Catherine's soul in every church in England. She planned to transfer her mother's remains to Westminster Abbey and give her a royal burial. The plan was never carried out, but the intention was there. Mary's reign lasted 5 years and is remembered in England primarily for its darkest aspects, the burning of approximately 300 Protestant heretics, which earned her the name Bloody Mary in the Protestant historical tradition that eventually triumphed. But Mary saw herself differently. She believed she was saving souls. She was acting in the spirit of a woman who had grown up at the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, monarchs who had established the Spanish Inquisition and expelled all Muslims and Jews from their kingdom. Religious uniformity enforced by the state was not an aberration to the world Catherine had inhabited. It was an assumption. Mary was, in this as in so much else, their mother's daughter. Were married to Philip II of Spain, the son of Emperor Charles, was Catherine's dream made real in the next generation. The restoration of the great Anglo-Spanish alliance that had been forged when two children were betrothed across the sea half a century before. But Mary's personal life was as tragic as her mother's had been. She fell desperately in love with Philip, who viewed her with cold political calculation. She suffered 2 phantom pregnancies, were body deceiving her, were longing for a child finding no outlet. She lost Calais, England's last continental position, in a disastrous war. And she died on the 17th of November 1558 at the age of 42, probably of uterine or ovarian cancer. Their last thoughts, it was said, were of their mother. After her death, England's throne passed to Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The Protestant succession was restored. The Catholic restoration was reversed. Everything Mary had built was dismantled. The victory had been real, and it had been temporary. Catherine of Aragon lived 50 years. Of those, 35 were spent in England, a country that never truly became her home, but to which she gave a quarter-century of devoted service as queen. She buried 6 children, some accounts say more. She endured the slow destruction of her marriage, the separation from her only surviving daughter, years of isolation and increasing squalor. She watched the country she had loved pulled from the church she had served all her life. And through all of it, she never broke. The question that historians have returned to again and again is the same one that her contemporaries debated across Europe. What if she had agreed? What if Catherine of Aragon had accepted the annulment, had agreed to retire quietly to a comfortable convent, perhaps to a generous settlement, and let Henry have what he wanted? The answer, of course, is unknowable. History does not deal in certainties about roads not taken. But the question illuminates something essential about who Catherine was. She could not agree, because for her, the question was not about preference or strategy. It was not about pride, though she had that in abundance. It was about truth. She had not, she swore under oath before God, consummated her marriage to Arthur. If that was true, and she went to her grave insisting it was, then her marriage to Henry was legitimate. Her daughter was not a bastard. 24 years of her life had not been a sin. To accept the annulment would have been to agree that they had. To say, in effect, he lied. It was not who he claimed to be. He dishonored the memory of my parents. He condemned my daughter. That was the price. And she refused to pay it. Her refusal set in motion a chain of consequences that altered the religious map of Europe. The Church of England was created not out of theological conviction, Henry VIII died a Catholic in most respects, but out of political necessity. The need to obtain a divorce that Rome would not grant. The Church of England, in turn, became the framework within which a genuine Protestant Reformation eventually took root in England. A reformation that shaped British culture, politics, and identity for centuries. The Empire, the British Constitution, the worldwide spread of English, the founding of the United States by Puritan settlers who traced their theological lineage back to the English Reformation. All of it, in some meaningful sense, flows downstream from the moment a Spanish woman refused to leave a courtroom in London. Whether this makes Catherine a hero or a villain, whether her stubbornness was noble or catastrophic, depends entirely on which side of the Reformation you stand on. For Catholics across Europe in the 16th century, she was a martyr. A woman who had sacrificed everything for fidelity to the true church. For Protestant England, she was the unwitting king of liberation, the woman whose refusal had forced the country to discover its own religious identity. For Romantics and feminists across subsequent centuries, she was something else again, a woman who refused to disappear, who insisted on her own version of truth in the face of the most powerful man in Europe, who held her ground when every structure of power was arrayed against her. Beyond her role in the great events of history, there was the woman herself. Catherine of Aragon was genuinely remarkable. She was fluent in Latin, French, Spanish, and English. She corresponded with Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest humanist of her age, who praised her learning and her mind. She governed England as regent, organized a military campaign, and won a decisive battle, all while carrying a child. She was the first woman to serve as an ambassador in European history. She built hospitals and schools. She supported scholars and artists. She gave alms, visited the sick, cared for the poor. And when the moment came that defined her, when the king she had served faithfully for 20 years demanded that she deny who she was, she stood in a packed hall, knelt before him, and told him the truth. Then she walked out. There is a simplicity to that gesture that transcends the complexities of theology and politics. A woman who had been stripped of almost everything, their country, their husband, their health, their freedom, eventually her daughter, had one thing left. Her word, her name, her truth. And she kept it. She was buried at the Peterborough Cathedral, not as a queen in the final insult that would have outraged her, but as a dowager princess. For centuries she lay there, largely forgotten amid the turbulence of English religious history. In 1536, the year she died, the break with Rome was complete. By 1550, when her daughter briefly restored the Catholic faith, it was already too late to permanently reverse the tide. By 1558, when Elizabeth succeeded Mary, the Protestant Reformation was effectively permanent. Catherine had lost. The church she died for lost. The England she had known was gone. Amtietai, the woman who lies at Peterborough, whose tomb is still visited today, still decorated with pomegranates by admirers who place flowers and notes beside it, is not remembered as a footnote. She is not remembered as a woman who failed. She is remembered as a queen. Not the queen crowned by men, though she was that too, but the queen crowned by her own life, by the choices she made under pressure, by the principles she refused to abandon, by the love she held for her daughter and the truth she held for herself. Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives, his vast ego, his tyranny, the religion he broke and the men he killed. His legacy is complicated, contested, morally troubling. Catherine of Aragon is remembered for something simpler and perhaps more durable. She was a woman who would not lie to save herself. And in the end, in the long reckoning of history, that was enough.